Hey guys, this is Yannick and I'm here with Dive, and I wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into my existential library. People keep asking me what is the best book to read on existentialism and on existential coaching. And while there is a simple answer, which is my book coming out in April 16th on existential coaching, there's also a very complex answer, which is it really depends what you want to learn, and it really depends on where you are in your journey and what you already know about existential philosophy or about coaching. So let me talk you through a couple of these and just say a few words and kind of introduce you to you can get an idea and a little bit of an overview of what's available. In terms of existential coaching, there is not a lot actually. We had the very first book that came out, Existential Perspectives on Coaching, which is written by Monica Hennaway and Emmy van Derzen, who I trained with at the New School for Psychotherapy and Counseling. This is an edited volume where Emmy and Monica give a bit of an introduction to what existential or the existential approach to coaching means. And then there are authors, practicing coaches who are existentially minded or use existential themes or techniques in their coaching. So this is a broad overview of how existential philosophy finds its way into existing ways of coaching. So very good to give you a little bit of an overview. Then the next that came out was Monica and Jamie Reed. They published Existential Coaching Skills, the handbook. I've got the first and I've got the second edition here. This is a wonderfully pragmatic book that gives you all of the tools, practical things, obviously from the perspective of Monica and Jamie, but there's so much fantastic stuff in there of how existential coaching could look like in practice. Here's a German publication on existential coaching by Dorothea Bürgi and Alfred Lengle, who both have been practicing existentially within organizations, mainly, but also a lot outside of them. So they come from a therapy background, but there's so many interesting themes, theories, concepts, lots of illustrations in there of how you could take themes from existential psychotherapy applied to coaching, but also really manifesting an approach in its own right. And it has that Austrian and Swiss mindset to it. So a lot more guided by models. And if you speak German, I really recommend that. Peltier has written a chapter in the Psychology of Executive Coaching on existential coaching, and if you have done my training, the guidelines are really, really useful. Obviously, he has his own style of applying existentialism to coaching, but particularly if you are working with clients in the executive world, then this one is a perfect chapter to get you a bit of an insight into what existential coaching is like and how it could look like in practice. Similarly, the Handbook of Coaching Psychology by my colleagues Stephen Palmer and Alison Wybrow. They have a chapter on the existential approach to coaching. And that's a fantastic first step into the more academic understanding of what existential coaching is and could look like. I obviously have to promote my own little book, that the first one that I wrote for Animus Center for Coaching, fantastic coaching school, really has existentialism in their DNA. And this was actually the first draft, if you want, to the book that's coming out in April. And my main aim was to take the often convoluted and complex existential themes and describe them and outline them in as simple language as possible, really relate them to the coaching context. And I'm summarizing a lot of what I have just introduced in the other books and try to put it in a brief format so that people can get an interesting insight into what existential coaching is like. And you can download this one until the book is coming out on my website, existential.coach. Here's Coaching in Times of Crisis and Transformation by Liz Hall. Liz is wonderful, and it's not a book on existential coaching per se, but given the nature of crisis and transformation, a lot of these existential themes are in this book. And the contributors range from Tony Grant to Dr. Sean O'Connor, Neil Scotton. There's so many people in there who've contributed chapters of how you could coach somebody in a time of crisis and transformation, and how you could help them through it. And the existential crisis is not in there outspokenly, but so many existential things that people are struggling with in times of crisis and transformation are in there. So it's a wonderful read and very relevant. Here's one of my favorites, which I must say also contributed to chapter 2, which is Nash Popovich and Deborah Jink's Personal Consultancy. This is the first book that came out that integrated in a meaningful way coaching and counseling. So it goes into a description of like where the differences are and how we might be able to think about the differences between coaching and counseling. And then there's different perspectives on how we could work with the personal consultancy model. I wrote about an existential perspective on the integration of coaching and counseling, because by the nature of the existential questions, boundaries get blurred and there's a big gray area, and it's not as clear as in other approaches where coaching ends and counseling or psychotherapy might perhaps begin. In terms of understanding existentialism, here's Yalom's Existential Psychotherapy. And yes, it's about psychotherapy, but he goes into great depth on what each themes mean, what are the paradoxes and the tensions at each level. And Yalom is a wonderful writer. You might have heard of some of his other books. This is academic work, which is the hallmark, quite a thick piece of work. That really goes into depth on the existential themes and helps you to understand how existential philosophy it looks like when it's applied to working with people. A wonderful, simple introduction to existential psychology is this one by Bo Jacobson. An invitation to existential psychology. This has actually been recommended to me by a former student who says this has made him understand existential psychology much more than any other book that he has read until that time. So a psychology for the unique human being and its applications in therapy is the subtitle. So given that there's so many parallels between coaching and therapy and counseling, all of this therapeutic literature has so much inspiration for the coach who aims to go a little bit deeper. You've got a for Dummies, an Existentialism for Dummies edition, which again, in the spirit of the series, really tries to make existentialism as graspable as possible and as easy to understand as possible. So I recommend you take a look at that if you don't know anything about existentialism yet and would like something very complex and challenging, but put it to a fun and easy way. It has lots of suggestions for reading, but also for movies, and it's really down to earth. I really like it. Similarly, in Existentialism, a graphic guide. I'm not sure if you know the series, but it's just full of little illustrations, fun cartoons, characters. So it's a playful way of introducing existentialism. If you think quite visually, this will be quite good. Here's Gary Cox's How to be an Existentialist. How to get real, get a grip, and stop making excuses. So this is the kind of self-help version to become an existentialist. I think for a self-help book, the language is still fairly complex, but it's certainly written in a way that is very engaging. And if you come across that in the bookshop, read a couple of pages on Google Books or something like that. See how you like it, and that might be a really good option for you. Rollo May wrote The Discovery of Being. This is one of the American psychotherapists who used existentialism. There was Irvin Yalom and Rollo May were two of the leading figures in the psychotherapy scene. And I just really love his writing style. He really gets to grips and in a beautiful way puts out what this human condition is about and how do people experience it. Just being is just such a state that emerges so raw in psychotherapy, and if we allow it to emerge in a coaching room as well. So meeting somebody where they are, lovely book on existentialism. One of my absolute favorites, The Gift of Therapy, or Irvin Yalom. It is about therapy. He explains his view on therapy and what a gift it is in many short chapters. There are often a page or maybe 2 pages, maybe 3, but short bursts of very down-to-earth, very pragmatic. How does it show up? How does he work with clients? How does he relate to people? How does he think about therapy? And packed full of metaphors and little stories. So it's a fantastic window into how you could work with somebody with an existential perspective. Similarly, Emmy van Derzen's Everyday Mysteries, packed with storytelling of people who grapple with these existential themes, and with it a great explanation of what the existential dimensions are, some of her models that she uses in psychotherapy, and a wonderfully honest and really poetically written account of how existential philosophy shows up with therapy clients. I like Existential Counseling by Martin Adams just because it's such a concise introduction to it. It's a very short book, you see, and packed with very tangible and easy to understand ways to explain how existential work could look like in practice. Same Adams, Martin, has written a book with Emmy, which is The Skills in Existential Counseling and Psychotherapy. Much more academically minded, but practical skills in applying existential ideas to the therapy room, and because of all the many parallels, also to the coaching room. The wonderful McCooper has written Existential Therapies, which is an outline of all the different existential therapies. You know that existentialists very often disagree on so many different things. They agree on the general human condition and the existential givens, but how they show up in life and how to best work with them when we work with a person in a coaching or psychotherapy room, there's different opinions out it. So McCooper wrote about different ways to approach this complex subject area. So I've got a couple of more general books on existentialism, on the philosophies, the ideas. One of the most popular is probably Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, a fairly short book that carried around quite a bit for some time, which outlines how man is search for meaning. It outlines his account on his times in the concentration camps, in part of the time he spent in Auschwitz, and the first half of the book is about his experiences, and the second half of the book is outlining his approach to meaning-centered therapy. So a lot of existential themes in their approach to death, life and death is so close, and really a very powerful read. So I recommend anybody to read Man's Search for Meaning. Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism and Humanism is basically a transcript of a lecture, of a very famous lecture he gave. In French, existentialism is a humanism. So he goes into the heart of his philosophy in a very short space of time. So it's really a fantastic introduction to Sartrean thought, and also to his approach to the existential ideas. Short read, given that it was a lecture, it's much better to read than some of the other philosophical texts, so I recommend it. You have Paul Tillich's The Courage to Be. He was a theologist, and I love the way that he puts out one of the main tenets of existentialism, really, as being as a courageous act in itself. Because as human beings we're so riddled by all these paradoxes and tensions, just being is a courageous act. And the courage to face your human condition and move forward despite the anxieties and the paradoxes and the tensions that we carry around. Very well written from the from the 50s, I think 54. so don't nail me back on the number. But give it a read. It's a fantastic invitation to take life and approach it as it is without deluding yourself and avoiding the experience of living and being. We have I and Thou, Martin Buber, which is a wonderful book about the relationship that we tend to have with not just people but also things and generally our environment. And you might have heard of I thou and I it relationships. I it as putting on a label or a category on people, on things, and that relationship of me to an object. You objectify everything. And that happens quite naturally as we go through the world. And to have those authentic relationships between one human to another human, just as two human beings, as if there is not that much difference between us really, is a wonderful account of building stronger relationships, not just with people, but with the world in general. Søren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. I really love how this book is made out, so the Penguin edition is just a joy to hold in your hands. Fairly short book as well, but really goes into the heart of his philosophy. He's one of the first writers who wrote about existential ideas in the 19th century. So the language is old, but it certainly is timeless. So anybody who wants to dig into the philosophical roots of existentialism and the early people like Søren Kierkegaard, Nietzsche was inspired by, for example, this is really useful. Really useful to get engaged in, and this is one of the most profound works in existential philosophy, I believe. If you want to really work through a text, you can work through Being and Time, which is Heidegger's text, Sein and Zeit. I had the questionable choice or honor to translate some of Heidegger's untranslated works for an article I wrote once, and it is really a text to work through. It's he goes deep into the German roots of the language. That's why a lot of the terminology he uses is the original German, because he really forces you to engage with a deep exploration of language and where it comes from and what it means to be, that experience of Dasein, of simply just being there, and the temporality of man. Everything ends and we exist towards our death, that idea of thrownness that we only can weave in and out of authenticity. So it's quite a philosophical text. It's something to work through, not to I didn't enjoy reading it, but I got so much from it. So one of the great works in existentialism, Being in Time. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, still after all those years, phenomenology of perception. Phenomenology is about exploring a phenomenon, really going into depth in exploring what a certain experience is like, how we perceive things, how we perceive the world. And this is one of the great works that goes into the heart of how you experience that, how that might work. And again, one of those texts that perhaps you might not enjoy for the simplicity or the easy way to transmit knowledge, but this is a philosophical text that gave me a lot, but that certainly needed some work. A wonderful book, The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. Jason Silver goes on, and they were very inspirational to him. Really goes into the concept of death and temporality, of we always try to avoid this perception of death, and we try not to think about death in that way. So all of these tricks that people use to deny the fact that we're dying so that we can live more happily, I guess. So Ernest Becker goes into a great account. So anybody who is interested in the concept of endings, temporality, death, this is one of the works you need to read. I was given a book about Christian existentialism, and I must admit I haven't read this one yet. But there's a common misconception that existentialists are atheists, and actually Buber, I mentioned Tillage, there's Søren Kierkegaard. So many existentialists were devout Christians. Perhaps they refused the dogma of the church, but they advocated a relationship with God, because existential philosophy does not is not mutually exclusive to the idea of God. So if that tickles your fancy, even if you are a Christian or if you're not one, this is a great account of exploring Christian existentialism, mainly based on the works of Søren Kierkegaard. So we have one that just came out, literally, is Neuroexistentialism by Greg and Jack Russo and Owen Flanagan. And this, I haven't read it yet because it literally just came out and delivered to my doorstep, but I figured I include this here. The subtitle is Meaning, Morals and Purpose in the Age of Neuroscience. So they looked at neuroscience and what it has to offer, and with all of the amazing research coming out and the advances in neuroscience, there is a shift in existential ideas. What I found most interesting is that concept that it might not be too unrealistic to think about the advancement of nanotech and biotech, and that perhaps the human body, that there could be soon a way to extend the human body indefinitely if we start manipulating the biological body like we would do with software. So it's interesting how our perception to death changes in the face of these advancements, but neuroscience certainly has a lot to offer. And yeah, I'm looking forward to reading this. I just wanted to include it. When we look at business and the organizational world, Monica Henaway has written The Existential Leadership, and also in July, I believe, her new book, The Existential Leader, will come out, which is in part based on her earlier work. I think existentialism has so much to offer to the area of leadership, because all of these themes, all of these experiences, all of these paradoxes and tensions that we feel as human beings, many of them are amplified when we are in a leadership position, in a position of even greater responsibility than just leading our own lives. So it's packed with amazing stuff. Monica, thank you. This book I have enjoyed massively. I came across the title and thought, this is so much up my street. Embracing Paradox and Uncertainty, Complex Adaptive Leadership. I was looking for books on leadership that will talk about existential themes. And paradox and uncertainty being big themes in existential philosophy. This book takes you through the evolution of organizations from machines to organisms, and all of along the way, so many different topics where paradox and uncertainty is part of the fabric of life and hence part of the fabric of leadership. And Nick Obliensky is doing an amazing job at laying it all out for you. So I highly recommend this one. David White has written probably one of my favorite books on work. He's just such a poet, so reading the book is like reading a very long poem in a way, packed full of his experiences and stories, and really helped me to shift my relationship with what I believe work to be, because in the end everybody works, even if we just go out and chop some firewood and come back, like all of us work. And if we manage to reformulate our relationship with work, not as something that we must do and we have to, but like there's something that is inevitable. And just this metaphor of crossing the unknown sea is such a wonderful metaphor for many entrepreneurs, but also life in general, as there is no certainty out there, and if we want to do great things and live our passions, we're going to have to leave familiar shores and leave our safe haven and start chartering out in the unknown sea. So, wonderful book by David White. Same search that I was on, looking for existential themes in leadership and organizations and management. Linda Hill done a piece of research where she interviewed and explored how it was like to become a manager for somebody who was really good at their craft, but then they stepped into a management position, starting to manage people. And there's just so much rich material in there in terms of how does somebody perceive the step up into a position of greater responsibility and now changing tasks. So this is a fantastic read. Here's another one that I must say I haven't read, but it just sounded fantastic and right up my street. It's called Not Knowing by Stephen Sousa. And it's written about work, and it's about uncertainty and not knowing. And I can't unfortunately tell you a lot more about this, but I figured I put it in here because it just sounds so relevant. So here I have Emmy van Deursen's Psychotherapy in the Quest for Happiness. Emmy van Deursen is an existential psychotherapist. This book is written for the quest for happiness, and I guess that's the positive existentialist in me that has understood that coaching clients always look for some form of happiness. So here's her approach to how people do that in psychotherapy, and really found quite inspiring to think about, well, it's not just existentialism, existential coaching. Ultimately, we do seek for this happiness feeling. So what is that made of, and how could that look like? And how people use a conversational space in order to find happiness. Staying with positive existentialism, here's the second wave positive psychology by my colleagues, former colleagues from UEL, Itai Iftzan, Tim Lomas, Kate Hefferon, and Piers Worth. And this is really the book, at least by the time of recording this in 2019, about positive psychology 2.0. The second wave of positive psychology really brings what I see as existential themes into the positive psychology space. So it's really important that they look at things like dialectics, and they look at the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell, kind of stuff, how we can use what are negative emotions actually good for. So it's packed with really good stuff. The word existentialism is not mentioned that often, but it really is at the heart existential. Darren Brown, very famous in the UK. Darren Brown wrote a book called Happy, Why More or Less Everything is Absolutely Fine. And I just like his writing style. Essentially, it's a book about Stoic philosophy, really. But what I really loved about it is that there's a whole chapter on approaching death in a positive way. And it doesn't get that much more existential. And he has talked to people who are facing certainty of death in terms of cancer diagnoses, and it's a fantastic account of people close to dying. And what that does, how can you approach death in a more positive way? So I really like this. Another one that's a bit out of the ordinary is here by Kenneth Ackerholm. It's called Talent Development, Existential Philosophy and Sport, on becoming an elite athlete. I've worked with some athletes, and I really liked the work with them because there's just this proximity to endings if you have an athletic career, because you don't know the next injury could end your career. Also, athletic careers tend to end a lot earlier than most other careers. So in the area of ethics and sport, and how existential themes apply to the arena of sports and athleticism, this is a fantastic resource. Existentialism in Excess, again by Gary Cox. It looks at the life and times of Jean-Paul Sartre, because he really lived quite a crazy lifestyle, from being chased by lobsters, tripping on psychedelics, and fucking his students. This guy was a coryphée. I'm not sure that word exists, but like thousands and thousands and thousands of people turned up to his funeral. He was quite the man, and his life is quite exciting. So this is an account of that, and if you wanted to learn more about how some of these people live their lives, that's a more exciting account. Certainly more exciting than Heidegger, who spent most of his early time writing being in time in a cabin in the woods before he became a Nazi. Also interesting. Perhaps Sartre reads a little bit better. I like Lou Marinov's The Big Questions. Some existential, some not so much. It's not themed within the existential realm, but I really like that it puts out some of the very big questions that people ask themselves, which inevitably we'll hear some of them either outspokenly or underneath the surface in the existential coaching room. So thank you for this. Also, Authentic by Professor Stephen Joseph. How to be yourself and why it matters. Again, packed with existential themes, but they're much more inspired by the humanistic, person-centered approach to coaching. But given that authenticity is such a relevant theme to existential thought and to existential coaching, how can I be aligned with my values and my beliefs? It's a fantastic resource if you strive to be more aligned with yourself and step into who you really are. And I didn't bring many novels, but this one is a fantastic one. The Veronica Decides to Die by Paulo Coelho, about a woman who receives a death sentence, but then tries to kill herself, but then not too many spoilers. It doesn't work. She lives, but then gets a death sentence of a certain amount of time, and just the richness of what's going through her mind and how she perceives this proximity to death is just an absolutely fantastic account of people meeting their endings. So there are many, many more, and I would be really interested to hear which ones did you find most helpful, not just from this list, but also anything that isn't included in this. There's so many more that could really give us an insight. There's the Existentialism for All project that you find through This is Existential. I really encourage people to show what books they read, what helped them to understand existentialism, and what helped them to illustrate existential themes in everyday life. So there's so many novels. Almost every good novel will have themes such as a life and death decision, or somebody struggling for meaning, making a decision, not knowing what to do, facing a dilemma, people trying to belong, struggling with their sense of self, that the uncertainty. There's every good story is made up of all of these existential issues, and I realized that every good novel will have at least some of these themes, and some make it more outspokenly than others. So do let me know what has brought existentialism to life for you specifically. And if you want to learn more about existential coaching, then go on Amazon and buy my book, An Introduction to Existential Coaching, coming out with Routledge on April 16th, 2019. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you got a bit of an insight and inspiration of what you could be reading. And I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.